Welcome to today's webinar, Build and Maintain Strength Training for Triathletes and Runners with David Glover and Krista Schultz. And the question we always get as coaches, especially from triathletes, is do I need to strength train? And it's a great quote by William Bear Bryant, who coached the University of Alabama to a number of national championships. So here's some myths. Number one, lifting weights will give me big, bulky muscles. Number two, if I strength train, it will slow me down. Three, strength training won't help my performance. And four, I just don't have enough time because I'm swimming, biking, and running.
Some strength training facts is strength training improves your muscles' ability to function. So you develop strength, not only strength, but also power. Power burns in the flame of strength. So you're going to be able to increase that lean muscle mass, which improves your metabolic rate, lower the body fat, decrease your risk of injury because you're becoming a more multi-dimensional athlete in a lot of ways by strengthening around the joints and the tissues that support the joints. So essentially balancing and causing or creating more symmetry around your skeletal structure. And we talked about, or I mentioned the increasing lean muscle mass and metabolic rate. So boosting anabolic hormones such as testosterone, which is lowered through endurance training, and slowing that aging process. So as we age, our muscle mass decreases. The strength training will help increase that muscle mass.
So the things we want to cover tonight, we're going to go through this pretty quickly. But starting with just sort of how muscles function and how they get stronger, common injuries and their causes. So as triathletes, if you haven't been injured, you're the exception rather than the norm. So overuse injuries are very common in triathlon and running. We'll talk a little bit about that. Talk about some principles for proper exercise technique. Then we're going to share with you some sample exercises and routines. All of these we have on video, so we're not going to spend too much time on them in this presentation, but we will send out the presentation afterwards with a link to all the videos so that you can try them out. And finally, we'll talk about special considerations, specifically athletes as we age, so 40 plus, and special considerations for women as well. So how muscles function. And Wolff's Law is sort of a great concept to understand. And basically it says the body conforms and adapts to the intensities and directions it is habitually subjected to. The bottom line, for example, if in triathlon, if you want to become a faster swimmer, you have to swim more. Same with biking and running. And of course, efficiency and form play into that as well. If you want to become a stronger athlete, then you have to train your muscles.
So basically, we move because our soft tissues, such as muscles, tendons, ligaments, connected to the skeletal system, like joints and so forth throughout our body, allow us to move. So nerve synapses through that soft tissue makes us swim, bike, run, strength train. The musculoskeletal system encompasses all of this. So all that soft tissue, the skeletal system, and that neuromuscular synapse, which our brains basically tell the musculature which moves the joints. So think about it in terms, I hear a lot of people say, oh, my joint's compromised, I need to get surgery. What about the musculature around that joint? Have you stretched it? Have you strengthened it? Have you worked with that? So just try to think about things more of a big picture when we go through some of the key points about strength training for triathletes and runners.
So I just want to touch briefly on there are essentially three main muscle fiber types, And if you've been around triathlon or even running for a while, you're probably familiar with the term slow twitch muscle fiber. So there's also so type 1, your slow twitch, so those are your endurance fibers. And we talk about a fiber, so within a muscle, so if I pick my gastroc muscle, which is one of my calf muscles, within that muscle there are many, many fibers. And so within that muscle there are different fiber types. So a muscle is not just type 1, type 2A, or type 2B. It's a combination of these fiber types. And genetics determines somewhat the proportion of what type we are. So some athletes are more suitable, or should say more genetically predisposed to endurance events, whereas some are more genetically predisposed towards power events. So your slow twitch, your type 1, they don't fire as fast, they're smaller, but they have a lot of endurance. Type 2B on the other extreme, so these are power. These generate speed. They're bigger fibers. They contract really fast, but they also fatigue really easily. And then type 2A is in between the 1 and the 2B. So they actually have characteristics of both. So depending on how you train them, you can either train them to be more for endurance or more for power and speed. A key point to recognize is how these muscle fibers are recruited. And so again, within a given muscle, so I say the gastroc muscle in my calf, it's made up of all these different types of fibers. What happens is the body recruits the fibers it needs to do the action. So if I'm walking, so if you look at the chart there, how to read this is, if you see that first little line going up, so those are the type 1, the slow twitch. So those, as I start to move at a lower intensity, I start to turn on those fibers. So you say if I'm walking, I'm basically using type 1 slow twitch. As I go faster, my body starts to recruit more fibers. So it starts to recruit the type 2A. And so then I start running. So then I've basically got a combination of the type 1 and the type 2A. And then as I go faster, or say I need to generate more power, say I'm doing a power clean in the weight room, or I'm doing an all-out sprint, then I need to recruit those fast twitch type 2Bs. So basically what this is saying is, in order to train these faster muscles, the type 2A and type 2B, we have to do higher intensity. So if you just go out and do low, zone 2 aerobic exercise, you're probably going to recruit some of the 2A, but chances are you're not recruiting the 2B.
Yeah, one of the things we have learned in research is that we can convert fast twitch muscle fibers to slow twitch through capitalization, and not vice versa. So it's, when you look at power athletes or athletes training for endurance, those muscle fibers may cross over more than the endurance athlete trying to become the power athlete.
So I want to talk a little bit about injuries, and the reason being is, if you can read this quote there, but 50% of triathletes sustained an injury in the 6-month preseason. So that's before they even started racing. 37% were injured during the 10-week competition season. So that's a study that looked at the rate of injuries a few years ago. So again, it's very, very common, unfortunately, to get injured in training for triathlon, and also running as well, because a lot of times the injuries tend to be running related injuries.
So basically, why do so many endurance athletes get injured? And if you're a coach, or you've been in the triathlon world or running world for some time, chances are you've experienced some level of aches and pains and or different types of injuries. And this is attributed a lot to the way we train in general. And the other thing is our lifestyle. So the endurance athlete trains in fixed planes of motion. We're moving and throughout a very particular range, especially with cycling. And that can cause problems because the muscular stabilization that is not being utilized during that fixed movement becomes weaker and out of balance. So the benefit to strength training, moving in different planes of motion and strengthening those other muscles we're not using, is to stabilize the joints and create more power, but more importantly, prevent injury. And we all know about lifestyle, sitting in front of that computer, compromising our spine and, hunching over, lifting our foot up, leaning to the side, causing some pelvic instability, not utilizing some of our core stabilization muscles, while we're in one position for a long time. So all these things can lead to injuries, and that's basically how things come about. They start with posture and basically, becoming very one-dimensional with what you're doing. So common problems, and this just kind of addresses the reasons, we're just kind of build on that last slide, why injuries happen, and what are common muscle weaknesses and imbalances, because we are working in those fixed planes of motion. The asymmetry of the muscles is very important because, for example, if I'm cycling and I'm using my quadriceps muscles a lot or hip flexors, and my glutes aren't firing properly because of fatigue or poor body position, poor bike fit, whatever it may be, my glute muscles become weak and my quad and hip flexors can become more dominant, which will throw off the stability of the pelvis and tighten those front area muscles and weaken the posterior chain muscles. So doing exercises, we love to do a particular type of training called foundations to create some posterior chain firing. And an example of that kind of exercise, a foundations movement, would be standing like an overhead squat position and just holding that position. Another common problem, loss of proprioception, which is basically how your muscles move in space. So you get a feel for, I teach a strength class, and we were doing some lateral skipping. So if you haven't tried that, try that. Try not to cross over your legs. So that proprioception from right to left, horizontal planes of motion, and just even diagonal planes of motion, where you're moving, you're not in that straightforward movement pattern, can be hard. So you lose that proprioception. So training those are important. Range of motion is key. Hip mobility, shoulder mobility, those are all important. When you do a needs analysis of sports, those are key things for triathletes to have. So yoga, doing scorpions, Spider-Mans, those are all important for range of motion. Poor joint and core stability, kind of falls along with being in those fixed planes of motion. And doing strength exercises on one leg, great movements like squats and deadlifts, where you're loading the body and the core has to hold up that weight. So you actually load over the spine and the core muscles support that. Poor balance, we talked about one leg exercises, which are great. And overuse injuries. We do the same thing over and over. So common overuse injuries are, and you've probably heard a lot about IT band and plantar fasciitis. I know I hear about that stuff all the time. But those are just things that are caused from repetitive movements and imbalances, and they can be easily fixed when you are doing a good strength program. A lot of times when we go to physical therapy, they give us stretches and strengthening exercises. And I put that in the same category as strength because those are exercises that strengthen the body. Even yoga practice, it's, a lot of times more therapeutic, but, you're working on components that help to strengthen the body when you increase range of motion. mobility and so forth. So to prevent these common injuries, we do things to strengthen the body, and that includes weights, isometric holds, yoga practices, all kinds of stuff. So other causes, I think a lot of triathletes are guilty of doing too much. So the more the better, right? And in a lot of cases, it's just not true. We need a certain amount of muscular endurance to train the body to endure the event. But instead of working on efficiency, power, the important things that make us faster for those distances, a lot of times we're guilty of just doing more, regardless of the movement efficiency or the intensity of that particular workout. So that's a huge one. Sudden changes in training volume. You go out for a 5-hour ride and your longest ride has been an hour and you haven't done 5 hours in over 3 months. So that's a big one. Poor body mechanics, which because of our lifestyles could carry over a lot of times and does into our bike positions, running positions, and swimming. So one of the things you can control is warm up and cool down. And a lot of times that will help just increase the blood flow to warm the muscles, the joints, and that's a huge one for preventing injuries. So get into those practices. We have a lot of examples on our website of, good warm-ups, dynamic stretches, drills, and inadequate rest. We don't get more fit or strong until we rest the appropriate amount of time. So when we, overload with training in general, without adequate recovery, we never really reach our true potential. So that's really a big key point there.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about getting started with strength training. So we just want to touch on some key principles and basically some guidelines that we can give you to get started.
So just quickly, we talked about planes of motion. And if you look at the sagittal plane, that's typically what we're doing, when we run and when we bike. And a lot of times, thinking about swimming too, we move a little bit more in other planes of motion in the water, transverse if you're rotating properly, frontal with breaststroke, backstroke. So, trying to, and there's examples under these planes of motion, do strength training in all these planes of motion. And even in sort of a diagonal plane of motion too, as long as your joints can handle that and your body position is appropriate. So don't load things that you don't feel stable or efficient doing, meaning don't put weight to those movements until you perfect them. But I used to develop a lot of my programs for cross-country runners based off of planes of motion. And it helped a lot because, when you do a needs analysis, again, of an athlete, especially, a runner, different kinds of sports even, they need to be strong in those planes of motion. And if you're not strong in all of those, the sagittal plane of motion is weak.
So just some good guidelines. So you can think of these as guidelines or principles that should underlie any strength training routine. So you want to incorporate exercises that incorporate stability, balance, strength, and power. We'll go through some examples of how you can adapt exercises for those. Loading your spine, so that's something like having a barbell on your back or overhead. One thing that helps with, we'll talk about a little bit later, is sarcopenia. So as we age, our bones become less dense. So by loading our spine, we can help prevent that. Enhance and engage the major muscle movers. So those are your major muscle groups, so your big muscle groups. So when we do a strength training routine, we don't want to focus on just our biceps and our pecs. We want to do whole body type exercises. Engaging stabilizers, so you can think of that as your core. And when we think about core, a lot of times there's a misconception that it's all abs. Well, yeah, abs are part of it, but there's also your back, your hips, all that connects and helps stabilize your trunk and your torso. Maintain a balance of strength across joints. So basically, when we're doing exercises, we want a symmetric strength. So we want to be equally strong on both sides of our bodies. Some general guidelines in terms of exercises: 8 to 20 repetitions, depending on the exercise. And as a general rule, I mean, if you're doing off season and you're not worried about your endurance training, you could go to failure. But in general, we typically go to fatigue, just so we don't trash our muscles for our other workouts. And then 2 to 3 sets per exercise. So if you're doing overhead squats, for example, you want to do 2 to 3 sets of that, in a given workout session.
Yeah, and for all your strength training exercises, even your endurance training, I put together a little video to help you with good cues for proper body alignment. So while you're doing strength, for example, if you're doing let's say a shoulder press or a lat pull down and you brace through your abdominal, you're more likely to use your abdominals during that exercise. So bracing meaning you're preparing for someone to punch you in the stomach or initiating a cough or laugh. And it changes the exercise a lot. So the next one, knee toward pinky toe, I see a lot of people just kind of drop their knees inward, especially females, which we'll explain later. But if you think about knee alignment and, proper foot balance over the tripod of your foot, it helps to load the hips better rather than creating more of an imbalance. So pushing through the pedals, foot strike on running, doing a squat in the weight room. These cues, it's a very brief video, but they will help you, be mindful of what you're doing when you're doing it.
And when we send out a link to the presentation in Prezi, you'll be able to watch all the videos we have in the presentation. So now we're just going to kind of walk you through some example exercise routines. Again, all of these have videos, so either directly embedded in the presentation or in the last example, we'll have a list of exercises. Then we have videos for all those that you can find on our website.
Yeah, we talked about warming up being important, so we put together a video on dynamic stretches. You can do dynamic stretches before you run, before you bike, and I do them a lot before strength training, myself, for classes, for clients. And I just wanted to mention also, these exercises will give you, and the ones on the website, they're all great exercises, but you may not be able to, of course, do all of them, and some may be better for you to start with than others. It's good to get with a person who is very experienced and well-trained with strength training, such as a certified strength and conditioning specialist. A good website, Functional Movement Systems by Gray Cook. I use a lot of his assessments. For example, he does an overhead squat to measure shoulder and hip mobility. If someone has pain doing that, whether it's in their knees, hips, or they can't perform it properly, I'm not going to start them with an overhead squat or any kind of squat. So it's important to maybe, if you do have aches and pains, talk to your physical therapist and then your coach or your strength coach. Or refer to that website as well, or reach out to me because I may be able to give you some good ideas. So moving on from warm-up, we've got a great routine, 4-point stability. So, even a plank, sometimes people have trouble with a plank, keeping proper body alignment. But you can also do an 8-point plank where you drop your knees and bring your elbows in front of your shoulders. So you're essentially toes, knees, elbows, and hands are on the ground, and you're pulling those elbows and knees just thinking about pulling them toward the belly button. So that's a good modification of the front plank. There's a lot of variations, but that's a great deep abdominal exercise. So that's one of the 4 points. The second one is a side plank. You can easily modify that by bending your knees. But if you have any shoulder issues, it could be painful. So, for the side, you can also, to work those deep abdominals, I recommend a dead bug, great exercise, or, some kind of light rotational movement standing. But, doing the side plank is excellent if you can handle it and do a modification. And then we have, of course, right and left, the back bridge. So a bridge is great. I like to use a tennis ball in one of the hips and do a one-leg bridge. The tennis ball, if you, for example, put in your right hip and lift your right foot off the ground, you want to squeeze that tennis ball with the right hip and just bridge with your left leg. So the tennis ball helps you keep the hips neutral while you're doing that. And of course, I always get people to do double leg bridge and put something in between the knees to make sure everything feels right and they can utilize their adductors, inner thigh muscles. But the one leg bridge will help those adductors work too. So these are 4 things, 4-point stability, you can do rather quickly and repeat several times.
Yep, and as I mentioned before, we'll send out a link to the presentation, so you'll be able to watch these directly in the presentation. You can also find them all on our YouTube channel for ENDURANCEWORKS.
And we do talk about progressions as well as modifications, so there's all kind of variations of those. And then there's a video here, 4 exercises to improve cycling efficiency. And I do talk about the dead bug. It's a great deep core exercise. When I say core, I mean deep abdominal, transverse abdominis. That layer, that deep layer that stabilizes our pelvis and our spine. So dead bugs are excellent. One of my clients calls them dying bugs because you look more like a dying bug when you're doing them. And then the other 3 exercises I talk about are one leg stance, squat exercise, and working the middle back. So where you're doing a double external rotation. And basically what we're trying to do here is work all these muscles that help posture when you're running and riding. And I referred to the functional movement system, Gray Cook. He teaches a lot of, he calls them functional exercises, which you may or may not have heard of. And those are exercises where you use multiple muscle groups at one time. And again, when you do these complex exercises, for example, let's just use a squat, you still want to be able to do them pain-free and properly. So you may have to start with, isolation or, modifications of things. So I just put together a little bit of a full body strength routine. A push press was a powerful movement, and it's an overhead press with a hip drop. So you're basically, getting everything to fire at once. And again, starting with lightweight, making sure the technique's correct is good. We have videos of all these. And if you can't do the push press and you can't press overhead, you can obviously do maybe more of a squatting exercise, modified pressing movements, or just more working the shoulder stabilization, doing lateral arm raises. Then we have overhead squats. And then variations of that, so progression, split squat, single leg squat. I use single leg squat as a little test for people in my class. So as we do strength and progress single leg movements, I just test them. I'm like, okay, stand up straight, head and knees behind your toes, stand on one leg. The leg in the air is bent at 90 degrees. Try to lower and touch that knee of the raised leg to the ground, or as much as you can without bringing the knee and head over the toe. Hard to do, but good test. Push-ups, plank push-ups. So you can see we're utilizing full body. There's not bicep curls. You can add supplementary movements, but when you pull, you use your biceps. When you push, you use your triceps. So all of these exercises are more functionally based. Calf raises, obviously you're standing and focusing on the calves. You can do those bent knee with a machine, or actually just bend your knees and do a calf raise. Crab walks with the band, lateral movements. So just a nice full body routine for you.
And all these exercises are on our website at enduranceworks.net/resources, and there's a link to all the strength and stretching exercises or videos we have.
Yeah, the calf raises I do in toe in, toe out, neutral. And again, you're strengthening, your calves. Even if they're big, it doesn't mean they're strong in all those planes of motion. So you can really help prevent calf, Achilles, foot injuries by doing those movements if they're not painful.
So a question we get a lot is, when is the right time to do strength training? And if we kind of break down in the year into three pieces, preseason, sort of, you say from January, February, up to the start of your racing season. So whatever, that's typically May for most athletes, but maybe April. Competition, so basically through the summer, and then off season. So, from a lot of us, at least in the northern hemisphere, we're in our off season now. But the key point here is, strength training is appropriate year round. The emphasis may change, so sort of how your training will change as well. The nice thing about the off season, it gets dark early. It's hard to get outside as much. The weather can be crappy. Strength training it's a great time to put a little bit more emphasis on it, because you don't need to be doing as much swimming, biking, and running, and it gives you a chance to do stuff indoors as well. And probably the competition is the season is probably when you're going to be doing the lightest amount of strength training, just in terms of you want your body to be able to fully handle the training load from the swimming, biking, and running. So if you're in your competition season or near your competition season, you tend to be doing higher intensity race pace like efforts. So you don't want to do too much strength training, but the emphasis still would be on working on whole body movements, maybe less weight, and to fatigue, so not to complete failure. So you want to be able to recover fully from session to session. Special considerations. So what happens is, as we age, and I thought, looked at some research papers, and it's a lot of things go down. So as we get older, we lose muscle strength, we lose power, we lose endurance, muscle mass, fiber size, muscular metabolic capacity. So that's how active our muscles are. So if our muscles are less metabolic, they're actually burning less calories too. Resting metabolic rate. So you can think of that as, if you're not doing anything, how much energy is your body using? Higher resting metabolic rate, you're just burning more calories than a lower one. Body fat increases. Bone mineral density, so sarcopenia. So especially I will talk a little bit about female athletes, but they, this can happen with male athletes as well. So the importance of strength training, physical function, and anabolic hormones. So these are all things that happen as we age, and it really impacts our performance. So the nice thing is, if we kind of looked at all the arrows on the left side under aging, if we do strength training, it actually counters all of those things. And there's actually been some interesting research, if you look at it, that in some cases, we talked about the muscle fibers early on, of you kind of have to use them at higher intensities in order to engage the fast twitch fibers. So if you're always doing low intensity stuff, you're not using your fast twitch fibers, so you're not training them. So what happens is, you use it or lose it over time. You're not using them, so they tend to shrink. So one of the benefits of strength training is, because you're using those fast twitch fibers, you're maintaining your muscle mass, and a lot of these other things as well. So a lot of benefits to strength training, and just a real quick comment on endurance training. It can actually reduce your anabolic hormones. So strength training is sort of a good balance with your endurance training.
Yeah, it's interesting when we look at the effects of chronic fatigue, adrenal fatigue, and you look at research around that, and there's, imbalances in the endurance athlete. We were talked about being, a multi-dimensional athlete and balancing the strength training into the endurance training more, being very helpful. And just a little bit about males versus females. The typical female makeup, and it's not the case with every female, but for childbearing purposes, our hip joints are wider than males, and also, more importantly, wider than our knees. So they term that the Q angle. And the big thing with the Q angle is that the lateral part of our knee joint, the musculature around that too, sometimes can get stressed, if we're not careful about balancing the strength and the, movement patterns. So, being aware of knee position a lot of times is key when loading the knee joint. So we're, underweight or under constant stress. We don't want to, compromise that joint. We're all different. We're, sometimes our skeletal structure is naturally a certain way, but we want to, line it up so it's not causing issues, long term or, even initially with our endurance activity. Our muscles fire at different response times. So a good example is the hamstrings. So the hamstrings, there's research on, women's hamstrings firing a little bit slower than men's. They looked at soccer players and, changing movement patterns. So plyometrics are great as long as we don't overdo them and we incorporate them into the program properly, because that helps you improve the response time of the muscle. So that's part of helping you produce power is, improving the rate of muscle movement, so the velocity. And lower bone density, weaker upper bodies. So it's not all men versus all women, but just in a, general population standpoint, we look at, athletes and, strength training really helps, women improve that bone density and upper body strength, which, makes them essentially perform better. So, the body fat levels are typically higher. There's hormonal differences. And, those are all just important things to know, as a female in general, and as maybe a coach or a male teammate should be aware of. Not that it causes you to be any kind of a different athlete, but just maybe addressing certain things about a particular female athlete.
And success. So definitely, we're big proponents of strength training. We think it is a necessary component of your training, as it helps with injury prevention, balancing out muscles, and counteracts the effects of aging too. So this includes our formal presentation. We will have the recording at enduranceworks.net/resources/webinars. I'll send everyone out a link to it. You'll also get a link to the presentation so you can watch the videos, and I can also send you our YouTube channel has all the videos as well. Our next webinar coming up is December 1st, planning your next triathlon season. So that's sort of taking a big picture look at what you want to do next year. We'll go through talk through considerations for choosing races, and a big question we get is the spacing of races between each other. So we're going to address that too and give you some guidelines. We did get some questions ahead of time, so we're going to run through those real quick. If you do have any other questions, you can ask them through the little chat box to the right of the presentation that you're watching on YouTube. And again, thanks for your time, and we'll start running through the questions. And if you have additional questions, please ask.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start with these questions we had submitted earlier. Some of you may have the same questions, but feel free to ask questions along the way. First question is about Achilles strain and exercises specifically for that. So one of the things I'd start with, especially over the winter, is loosening those foot muscles and strengthening those foot muscles. So I like to use a golf ball. You can use a lacrosse ball, or Trigger Point Therapy has a ton of great equipment. Just roll over your foot, break up some tight spots. You can do the same thing with the Achilles calf area as long as it's not too painful. You can always stretch that area out. But once you have less pain, it's really important to strengthen. The video I have on the calf exercises, it shows me doing heel raises, neutral, toes pointed in, toes pointed out. So even though you're using your calves when you do endurance work, you're putting a lot of strain, again, on just one pattern of that muscle. And muscles fire in several different patterns, especially when there's several so the calf, Achilles, there's two parts to that. There's a deep muscle and a muscle on the top, soleus and gastrocnemius. So the gastroc may get worked a little bit more or less, different angles of it. So you definitely want to incorporate good stretches, back, straighten your leg, use a kind of a belt or a rope around your foot like you're stretching your hamstring, but move your foot from right to left, and that stretches the lateral part of the soleus, which is really deep. So, if you don't go to a PT, definitely start with loosening up. I love those E-stem units too, the TENS units. You can buy those online. It's great to help get blood flow through the foot and calf. But again, loosen the foot and calf, stretch, strengthen, and any kind of therapeutic stuff, massage, yoga, all those great things that help heal that is really key. So get on a little bit of a plan with that, and structure it so you don't have to deal with it when you get into your race season and heavy training.
Okay, and here's a set of 4 questions. They're pretty straightforward. First question is, do you do the strength training after or before workout? And the answer is it really depends. I like to bundle my workouts together. So for example, if I'm going to the gym to swim and then I like to strength train, what I found works for me is if I swim first, so my arms aren't fatigued, and then I can go in and strength train and actually have good strength. I've found the other way around. If I lift weights and go into the pool, my arms tend to be dead. But a lot of it really just depends on what works for your schedule, what's convenient. Obviously the more you do, the more weight you lift, the heavier, the more fatigue you put in your muscles, the more it's going to affect your other workouts. In a perfect world, you'd probably split them up. You do one workout in the morning, and then do something later at night. That way, you're not they're not as affecting each other as much. What is the balance of doing high weight, low reps versus low weight, low reps? Oh, I'm sorry, low weight, high reps.
Yep. So I can address that. So basically, sets times reps times weight is your training load in strength training. So if you're doing less weight, more reps, you're not improving your strength nearly as much as your load may be high. So you're doing it a certain number of times. Let's say you're doing 10-pound dumbbell, we'll use bicep curls, and you do that 20 times. You're going to get more strength benefits out of doing, 15-pound dumbbells 10 to 12 times. So the difference between low rate, high reps is more of a endurance strength focus. I recommend, doing those complex movements like a squat and trying to increase the weight and doing less reps. But obviously, you want to start with a little bit lighter and more reps till your body can handle more of a load. So the end result is sometimes doing higher volume sets times reps times weight will increase your muscle mass. Lower volume, higher weight will increase your muscular strength.
Yeah, and if you think back to the chart earlier, we showed sort of the muscle fibers, how they're engaged. So if you're only doing a light load, so you're only walking or doing real light weights, you're just engaging those slow twitch fibers. As you increase weight or as you increase speed or power, you're going to engage more of those fast twitch. So it's more completely training the muscle versus you could think of it as partially training. Another question: frequency of doing workouts. Again, it's really what works for your schedule. In a perfect world, if you could get in 3 times a week during the off season, I think that would be great. I'd shoot for 2. During the season, I still think twice a week, and they don't have to be long sessions if you're using big muscle groups. So some of the exercises that we listed out in the sample, you're engaging a lot of muscle, so you don't really have to do an hour-long workout. It could be 30 minutes. Again, the answer is, frequency it depends. I'd shoot for twice a week. If you can do 3, great. And then balance of doing general strength training versus isolated specific muscle groups.
Yeah, we kind of addressed that in the presentation, but ideally you want to be able to address multiple muscle groups at one time when you do a movement, because that's how our bodies function when we swim, bike, run, and even just normal functions throughout the day. So if I do a lot of bicep curls, versus a row exercise, where in the row I'm using the back muscles and biceps, I'm not getting as much of that complementary muscle firing patterns from the back and the biceps. So I typically recommend, because first of all, we don't have a whole lot of time, I recommend more of those multi-joint movements like rows. If you have time and you want to do some bicep curls, nothing wrong with that. Sometimes I just do them standing on one leg, so I get a little bit more out of the curls. Just getting some of the stabilization muscles to work with a bicep curl. So again, more multi-joint complex movements are better.
Okay, and we got a question through the chat window. Any thoughts on the Les Mills body pump classes as a strength training option in the off season in combination with weight room work?
The biggest issue I see with like body pump classes, like the Les Mills, especially for an athlete that wants to strengthen and work on exercise technique, is that you do such high reps and low weight that you don't necessarily, you fatigue yourself a little bit more than you need to, and don't get as much of the get as much out of the weight as you could if you do less reps, more weight, and you have more recovery time. The other thing is technique. When I've seen some of those classes or had some athletes do that, they've come back, some of them, with injuries. So what I recommend is, if you are going to do those things, try to keep the load at a reasonable level so you can perform the exercises correctly, because you're doing a lot of repetitions. And it's more beneficial to, again, do more weight, a little bit less reps, focus on that technique and more complex movements. So not that it's bad. And if something that's working for you and benefiting you, I do say, okay, go ahead and do this. This is all I'm going to get. And in a lot of cases, I'll see some improvements from people doing that. But just I just recommend be careful with technique on those during those endurance kind of weightlifting classes.
Okay. I had a question that came in before. Is it good or bad to stick with the same routines week after week and only change weights and such?
So it's not necessarily a bad thing if you're trying to master certain exercises. Let's say like maybe a split squat. You're working on the technique and you master the technique, and then you increase the weight over time. But one of the things we look at when especially strength and conditioning professionals, an endurance athlete coaches a progression. So where are you trying to get to? You want to, strengthen a multi-joint movement like a squat, but we have to start with, maybe a shoulder mobility and hip mobility exercise. So we're graduating to a squat, or we're starting with a, basic squat and graduating to a split squat or one leg squat. And when we get closer to the season, we're doing less weight, maybe a little more stability work. So that kind of fits in with the exercise progression. But in those middle phases, working on the increasing the weight of the back squat is key, because, if you've mastered the technique and you're loading those muscles, that's going to generate a lot of power when you cycle. So I would say try to incorporate some kind of progressions, but maybe keep some of those core movements like a squat and a deadlift in there and increase the weight on those until you get too close to, high training loads or racing season, and you have to back off on those weights, make them more complex. Do one leg deadlift, one leg squat, vary things like that.
Okay. Another question that came in before. I'm switching from a road bike with aero bars to a tri bike over the winter. Any certain exercises I can do to strengthen the new muscles I'll be using? Thanks. So one thing really important with bike fit, especially if you're changing either to a new bike or, in this case, a new type of bike, bike fit is probably the most important thing you can do to properly set yourself up. So ideally, when you're in a tri position, you're supporting yourself with your skeleton rather than your muscles. To the extent that you're going to have to use some muscles, like your neck and shoulders, to keep your head up and stuff. But first, most important thing is get a good bike fit. Earlier on, we had talked about 4 exercises. So exercises that focus on your back, your abs, and your glutes. So all are good exercises you can do in that little routine from Krista. So there's a couple of questions related to strengthening, increasing mobility of joints, knees, and ankles.
Yeah, and the best things you can do for the knees and ankles are those core lifts, like your squats and your deadlift. And sometimes what I do in my strength class, I have people take off their shoes, and what that does is really help strengthen. Because when you have your shoes on, you have receptors in your feet that tell your body how to react. So if you take your shoes and socks off and you do some movements, you actually get a lot more benefit out of strengthening the ankle and the knee. The exercises just become harder. Say like a overhead squat with a stick, as basic as that. And then, even a good morning exercise where you use a stick or a light bar, or a deadlift with dumbbells. And you can do all those things one leg with light weight, barefoot, and you'll strengthen ankle, knee, hip. Power moves are great too, but starting with things like a deadlift, learning to extend the hips when you come up on the deadlift and extend the knees and ankles, where those muscles are strong enough to handle the loads, are great strengtheners for the joints.
Okay, and looks like we're about out of time, so I'm just going to do one more question. Recommend or strength training for athletes that are pre-puberty.
Okay, so yeah, pre-puberty, we've learned that it's okay to do some loading, but I always recommend, movements where you work more like gymnastics movements. So, the pre-puberty athlete is learning to move their body weight efficiently. A good example is like a pull-up. You can, if you have an athlete that has good shoulder mobility, a young athlete, and you teach them to do a pull-up, that's a full body exercise. A lot of plank exercises, doing variations of plank exercises, side plank. So you're, stimulating the muscles, teaching them to be strong in different patterns and not doing too much loading, but eventually working on loading, but looking at technique and movement patterns. So, we look at children a lot in a lot of our strength seminars and how they move, and they're very flexible. They move in all different patterns when they crawl, when they sit upright. So we want to try to maintain that in, our bodies. So pre-puberty athletes are a good subject for focusing on just movement.
Okay. Well, thank you, Krista. Well, thank you all for attending tonight. Again, I will send out an email probably sometime tomorrow with a link to the recording and the presentation, so you can watch all the videos within the presentation, and as well as a link to where you can find the videos on our website as well. Please contact us with any questions or feedback. We just did YouTube streaming for the first time tonight, so I'm curious if anyone has any feedback, good or bad, on that. And other than that, have a good night, and good luck with your training.
Thank you all for your time and joining us. Appreciate it, and let us know if you have any questions.